Okay, we'll get started now. Welcome everybody to the week 6 discussion, which is really more nothing really technical, mostly focused on how to um, create your farm report, sort of basically transmitting both requirements slash expectations from our side, but also giving you some guidance, more like suggestions about maybe how you want to go about this, what tools you can use, so on and so forth. So the best place to start is actually an announcement we made yesterday on Piazza, which was about the posting of the Farm Report template and guidance. And I want to preface everything here by saying that the only requirements for the final report are in the content that is captured by that report, not in terms of the format. We've provided you the template, a template, which is based on an IEEE conference paper template as an option, right? It comes with styles and formatting and, it makes your final report look relatively professional. But by no means must you submit with that formatting, with that template. If you just want to write, single column, Courier as opposed to Times New Roman, 12-point font, whatnot, that is entirely fine. But we do expect that whatever format you submit, that you have the content we're expecting, which is what we'll address now. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which has the template. It's going to look a little small, but we'll try to zoom in and make sure it's legible for everybody. Okay, so everyone should basically see this is the template, and let me try to full screen this. That doesn't help. Let's back out of that. That doesn't help. Okay, so this is the PDF version, but obviously there's a Word or DocX version of this that is actually the editable template, but we're going to look at the PDF version for now. What you're basically looking at is a blank, or sort of a blank skeleton of what your report might look like. And what you want to take away from this is all the text that is in black, all right, is the required sections, all right? These are things that you need to insert whatever your project would put forth in those areas, okay? So obviously you want to come up with your own title, your name. Let's zoom in a little bit here. Your name, email address, just, so we're consistent, we know who's submitting this report. All the text that is in red, like you see here, red and underlined, or, as we go to another section down here, all this text is all just guidance, all right? You're welcome to read it, ignore it, whatever you'd like. It's not anything, what we would say requirements, but you should remove the red text for sure and replace the black text. The green text here, all right, is basically telling you if you use the actual template as a formatting guide in Word, then the style that is being applied, right? So when you go and you pick the style to get it to look like this abstract, you're picking the abstract style, or you want the keywords, you put keyword style, so on and so forth. And the first instance in this example where we use each of the styles, we show which style is being applied, and then we don't repeat it. So keep an eye out, all right? So for example, this is heading 1, but then we don't use, here we don't list heading 1 again because it's already saying, for the next heading at this level, you would apply heading 1. body text, heading 2, so on and so forth. Bullet lists are an important one to keep track of just because they are not your standard bullet lists like from the ribbon. It just gives you, given that this is a 2-column format, you want to, if you do the standard bullet list, you'll lose quite a bit of writing space. So this has been specially formatted, so on and so forth. All right. So all that said, let's talk about what you're required to submit in your final report. Right. So like I said, you want to have a title. It should be descriptive. It should be, but be concise. So, you know, if your hypothesis or your project is about quantifying effective obstructions on RSSI, that could be your report title. Quantifying obstructions on Bluetooth RSSI, you know, it could be as simple as that. Or if it's about orientation or the effective humidity, or, you know, you actually went and you built a detector. Maybe your detector was just a critical value detector. It's like, implementing a critical value detector for proximity detection or COVID-19 tracing. Or if you use machine learning, you could, put, so I know you guys will come up with something that's reasonably descriptive. Okay. Obviously, give us your name. Give us your name, give us your email address. Those are pretty standard. The abstract, this is what I would prefer, but we're not looking for novels. So write a single, so one, brief paragraph summarizing your report's content. And there's a link, there's a reference we provide for some useful guidance on what a good technical abstract should address. But just to give you some ideas here is you should be able to take maybe, you want to break your abstract up into 2 sections basically, or 2 parts. One is where you introduce the hypothesis of the problem you're trying to address, and then the second half is how you did it and what the results were, what your conclusions were. So, and since a single paragraph, I would recommend using only 2 or 3 sentences per each of those halves. So you're looking at 6, 7 sentence long abstract. So here's a good question that somebody asked: would you recommend writing the rest of your report and then coming back to abstract? Absolutely, that's a great way of doing it. By putting all your thoughts together, then you can sort of distill all those thoughts into an abstract. But really, you can go either way. Just you obviously you'll probably want to revisit your abstract one way or another, right? If you write a version of it first, and then you write the rest of your final report, you'll want to go back and make sure your abstract is consistent. So maybe, like the question suggests, if you write the rest of the report, you don't have to necessarily revisit it. You can make it consistent from the beginning. The next section you should have is keywords. This is really only, this is a suggestion and ask. So any keywords you think better identify your project. So think of these as basically search terms. And allow you to really focus in on, in the larger scope of PyPact and larger scope of PACT, larger scope of Bluetooth-based contact tracing, what was your project mostly about, right? Was it mostly about collecting RSSI data, or are you doing the detector development? Were you doing something else? So just things that sort of cue us in onto what your focus of your project was. But if you don't feel like there's anything super meaningful, or you don't want to bother with it, you don't have to. You don't have to include those. Okay. So now we get into the meat of the report. Okay. So there's basically, if I remember correctly, there's 6 main sections. And each of those sections is at the heading 1 level. And then where we do put heading 2s in each of those sections, we are proposing that as a further subsection, just because it'll help you organize your thoughts. or we think it'll help you organize your thoughts. So in heading, in introduction, right, you should provide the following information. So you first want to describe what your project is at like a high level, right, of what aspect of PIPACT or PACT or COVID contact tracing that your project is trying to address. And you want to keep this relatively concise. We're not looking for a novel. A lot of times, many of you, when you sent me your hypotheses, had a lot of that explanation regarding like how you think that has an impact on PACT or PIPACT. So here, you really want to focus on motivating why, right? Why are you doing this project other than to get a certificate, than to get, completion? But why are you doing this? Why did you focus on this aspect out of everything you could have addressed? Okay, so motivate the problem, all right? So after you do that, you'll want to provide any necessary background information about the core technologies involved, assumptions made, and or aspects not addressed. So let's break each of these down. So technologies involved, as was, I think we discussed this a little bit in a previous Q&A or another discussion, are things like, Bluetooth, the Raspberry Pis, RSSI, contact tracing. And by no means do you guys need to write mini novels about each of those things. You are encouraged to list them out and point readers to references where they can learn more about them independently. But you should feel and are responsible for providing that sort of go-to guide, that that prerequisite reading material, list of reading material that readers of your report should be familiar with before they go read the rest. Right? You don't want people to be going through the rest of your report and not understanding some very, you want them to be able to go through this report with some fundamental basics already understood. And this is where you point them in the directions where they can learn about that. So again, and by no means do you have to do this as all references. If you want to explain, if you feel like it's interesting to you, an exercise you want to undertake, by all means, describe Bluetooth in your own words, in your own description, describe RSSI, detectors, whatever. You can take the time and the space to do it, but I feel like it's going to be quite a bit of work, especially given the breadth of some of these topics, and you'll find your efforts better spent in the original work you did rather than sort of revisiting, just repeating information that you found out elsewhere. Okay. The second item, assumptions made. This is really important when it comes to defining the scope of what you're going to address. So when I say assumptions made, you have to think about it from the perspective of, if I just told you to solve Bluetooth-based contact tracing for all scenarios, for all situations, there's so many variables and parameters and configurations you have to address that the space of the work you would have to address is enormous, right? So enormous, you probably wouldn't, have gotten it done. So what you all have done to some degree have made assumptions, right? You've made assumptions about what set of this big problem you're going to address. So for example, you're only going to address the problem in indoor environments. So I assume one of your assumptions is that all this is done indoors, or you assume there are no obstructions, or you assume that the two devices are identical as they are with the Pis. So whatever assumptions you've made, and you don't have to be exhaustive, but you should put the main ones that helped you neck down or narrow the scope of your work to what it is now, right? You don't need to be as granular as, I only did this when the temperature was, 75 degrees Fahrenheit and that the wind was blowing in from the northwest, right? Nothing like that. But you should get, if it's an assumption that has an impact on how you did your experiments and what, or more importantly, which experiments you did, then you should list those. All right, so people can understand what is inbound and out of bound for the work. Because if you don't state that you made such an assumption, people are going to assume that you only did half the work, right? That you just ignored that aspect of it. And trust me, you don't want to be defending those positions when you obviously have an answer for them. And then finally, aspects that you didn't address, right? So this sort of relates to assumptions in the sense that you made certain assumptions so that you didn't have to address some source of variability or some source of complication that wouldn't have allowed you to complete your project. But there are other aspects that maybe you didn't make any assumptions about, but you just let it be what it was. So you didn't make an assumption about the humidity, but you didn't necessarily take it into explicit account. So, you know, maybe humidity might be specific, but maybe a more general example of that is you didn't take into account the exact sort of weather conditions, as it were, right? You're not addressing the variability in weather conditions. That's perfectly fine. That just, when people see that, when readers read that, they know that you're cognizant that that's something you did not address, that maybe future work needs to address, but you're not addressing it now. Again, this all goes to making people understand the scope of your work, just so that they don't go through this and feel like the work is incomplete, insufficient, because we know you've all put a lot of effort into this, and that's not the message that should come across. Okay. So I'll get to the second question later at the end. All right, next section, your hypothesis or hypotheses, all right? This is just where you're gonna define and explain either your single hypothesis or hypotheses that you valued during the project. For each of these hypotheses, you should discuss the following: how it relates to PIPACT, PACT, and or Bluetooth-based contact tracing in general, and it's up to you about what level or which levels and at what level you address or you sort of claim relationship to. So if you just want to talk about it in the context of PIPACT, that's fine. If you want to go as general as Bluetooth-based contact tracing, that's also fine. If you want to build it up sort of hierarchically, that's perfectly fine as well. But you should talk about it with regards to at least one of these levels of granularity, right? So that people understand how your hypothesis fits into the bigger picture. And then in your hypothesis, for any given hypothesis, what aspect or aspects require the most investigation? So for a lot of you, it's about what is the effect of something on the measured RSSI. So the aspect that requires investigation is that something, right? Like observing that variable or that phenomenology. For some of you, it's developing the detector algorithm. So the aspect that requires the most of investigation is the iterative development of your detector, right? About testing, evaluating, and refining your detector. So what you want to do with that statement is allow people to recognize where you spent the most effort, right? Because your hypothesis had a certain focus. So with these 2 points, you not only define how your hypothesis fits into the bigger scope, but give readers the guidance about where most of the effort on your project was spent. All right. And one important thing to note is here is where you're going to define or provide the shorthand by which you're going to refer to your hypotheses through the rest of this document. So if you just want to call, your first hypothesis, hypothesis number 1, you should refer to it as hypothesis number 1 throughout the rest of the document, all right? Or you just want to call it the hypothesis or the hypothesis under test or whatever it may be. Whatever language you use, be consistent throughout the whole document. Consistency also goes to formatting. If you want to bold, underline, italicize the hypothesis name so it stands out, by all means do. Just be consistent about it so people know you're referring to what you described in this section. All right, next section, experiments and data collection. All right, so in this section, you should begin by providing a high-level overview of the experiments and data collections you executed. So I'll get to the question I was just posted in a second, once I finish this thought. You executed. All right. So when I say high-level overview, this is as simple as just saying that you conducted experiments or data collections to collect RSSI values with respect to these variables or these parameters or these configurations. Stop. Right? That's it. That's the high-level overview. You just described, like, you did data collections where these were your free variables and these were your fixed variables, and that's the overview. So it should be fairly brief, but to the point. So now that I've described that, I just want to go back and answer a question that somebody asked regarding the previous section. In my experience, I collected data by varying a parameter, but then I also created a detection algorithm and tested and refined the algorithm with data collected. Would this be considered two hypotheses, or could I write it as one? I guess I would ask you, if your original intent, if your end goal is to develop a detector algorithm that is focused on implementing the contact tracing or supporting the contact tracing, then I would say you have one hypothesis. The hypothesis is about the development of that detector. However, if your goal is a little bit more nuanced in the sense of it's a detector focused on a certain subset of conditions. So for example, a detector focused on working when there are obstructions present, and you need to quantify the effect of obstructions on the RSSI, maybe you want to present that as two separate hypotheses. One about quantifying the effect of obstructions on RSSI, and then developing the detector. But you could still roll those two things together. There's no real wrong answer to this. I think it's just a matter of organization. How is it easiest for you to tell the story? Because you will need to, as you'll see in the later sections, you will need to address how you evaluated each of those hypotheses. And so if the two hypotheses are very strongly linked, or the two sort of like topics you've brought up are very strongly linked, it might make sense to have one cohesive arc in the form of one hypothesis, then sort of break them up and try to link the two with additional wording. So I don't have a straight answer for you, but depending on how nuanced or how much analysis or maybe how much focus you put on the data you collected, on quantifying it rather than just moving all the way through to the detector, that's where you might see a distinction between two versus one hypothesis. Okay, what if you didn't have a hypothesis and focus on creating a good machine learning model for predicting distance based on RSSI and TX-Fire and the measures you took to make it more accurate? It's not, if you remember, I sort of gave carte blanche to the notion of a hypothesis. Your hypothesis might be, turn an intent into a question or into sort of an existence proof. All right, the hypothesis in your case would be, is a machine learning algorithm capable of capable of predicting distance based on RSSI measurements? That's your hypothesis, right? At the end of the day, in order to evaluate the hypothesis, you need to develop and evaluate the machine learning algorithm, and really that's the end product. But coincidentally, you have a hypothesis that tracks with it, right? So you can always turn any sort of development, anything tangible you create, into a hypothesis just by casting as an existence question. Can X be developed, right? Can an effective X be implemented, which is what you've done. or what I hope you've done, but that's how I would cast your hypothesis. All right. So now going back to section 3, experiments and data collection, we talked about the high-level overview of the experiments and data collection. So after you have that high-level overview, you should have a detailed, it's 2 columns, so I apologize. You should go into more detail, not necessarily excruciating detail, into each of those following items. One approach to do this would be maybe I think I may have written this incorrectly, where each of the following items is each of the sort of types of data collections you did. And so I give an example here of a way you might be able to concisely present this as a table, where and I misspelled empirical, so shame on me. I really should have spell checked this. One option might be that you present each experiment as a row in a table. And you talk about, and what you should address is what hypothesis that experiment is trying to address, why you're doing this particular experiment. So, the hypothesis is about the effect of obstructions. And the reason is you want to empirically quantify the effect. And then, you can talk, and I just give an example here about how many times you repeated that data. But you could add whatever additional columns. So you could put notes, you could put, specifics, so if this might not be, or maybe one option in this particular example is I have an additional, instead of just the effect of obstruction, it's the effect of a specific obstruction, and the third column is of repetitions is what is the obstruction material? Did I measure clothing, human body, concrete, whatever it may be, and each one of those represents a different row. So that might be a concise way of doing it, but you can always do it in verbs and just plain text language. You can have each one have its own subsection if you want. That's perfectly fine. But you want to give a fairly clear indication about the breadth of the experiments you've done, what each experiment was intending to capture or quantify, and for what particular reason, right? How did that experiment help you analyze and evaluate your hypothesis or hypotheses? So there should be a pretty clear link. I don't think this should be very challenging. And again, always try to be as concise as possible. Don't use full sentences as much as possible, but going into writing mini novels for every section is not going to do anyone any good. All right. So let me see if there's any questions. Okay. So that's a double. So there's a question here. I did my experience more along the lines of, is it possible to create a detection algorithm that works well enough given some set of parameters regarding the devices? Is that a good hypothesis? One being a positive hypothesis, one being a negative hypothesis? Absolutely. Again, that goes to the fact that obviously your goal was to develop the algorithm, develop the implementation. The hypothesis is all about, an appropriate hypothesis would be, can this be done, right? I think you all should not underestimate, or should not overcomplicate the notion of what a hypothesis can be or should be. Hypothesis can be as simple as, I'll give a really blatant example and stupid example. Before we went to space, the hypothesis would be, can we breathe in space? Or breathe beyond the atmosphere? And obviously, to test this would, there's the obviously stupid way to test this, but the point is, all it is an existence, right? you go and execute the task. I won't get into how that would be done, but the positive and negative of that is, yes, you can breathe in space. No, you cannot breathe in space. And that is as equivalent to developing your detector or machine learning algorithm or whatever. Can an effective detector machine algorithm be developed? Positive hypothesis is yes, it can, and negative is no, it can't, right? And right, that doesn't feel like it has a lot of nuance, but that's perfectly fine. All right, so we addressed that. So I'm gonna go ahead and cancel that. All right. So here's a question from somebody. Would each experiment be varying a parameter? Example, experiment 1 is increased humidity, experiment 2 is decreased humidity, or is it all considered to be one experiment? Experiment tests different humidities. That's a little up to you. It's all about organization, really. It's about how it's easier for you to talk about and reference these distinct experiments, or reference the work you did. It may be easier to, in your case, to talk about using the humidity example is, if you refer to them as two separate experiments, then when you present the data like histograms or CDFs or PDFs, you can say this is experiment 1 CDF and this is experiment 2 CDF. There may be less ambiguity with that in regards to that. But if you want to describe it all as one experiment, that's fine. You just have to go into the nuances about the fact that in this one experiment, that there was a parameter that was being varied. It's a little bit of a matter of just a matter of organization about how you feel like the story is best told. So no strict guidance from us. Should the hypothesis be a statement or question? What is the question? I'm not sure about the second part of this. Either way, it can be, I would say the actual hypothesis should be a statement because you have a null, null / alternate hypotheses, right? H0 versus H1. Or positive versus negative hypotheses, or that set, and so the corresponding question, right? The hypothesis is actually technically the answer to a question. So it might be, can I do this? And one half of that hypothesis is yes, I can, and the second is no, I can't. So your hypothesis should be a statement. Where you say like what is the positive and negative halves of that hypothesis. But you can start by saying, here's the question that has led to this hypothesis. Can the hypothesis be longer than a sentence? For example, a paragraph to account for background information, or should that go in the introduction? So you should put any background information you feel is not necessarily extremely specific to your hypothesis in that introduction section. So that should be like high level, sort of common to PAC, common to COVID tracing, common to Raspberry Pis, common to Bluetooth, sort of, all this stuff. If you have some things that are specific to a hypothesis, you can absolutely explain it in the hypothesis section. And you can absolutely use more than a sentence, use multiple paragraphs. That's fine. This is where you want to fully explain how you arrived at the hypothesis or hypotheses you're going to evaluate. So use as much text and time as you need. Should we consider a null hypothesis? You don't necessarily need to. I think I generally include it when I'm talking about hypotheses just to be explicit. It shouldn't be a significant amount of extra work. I just think it adds some formalism. and also eliminates ambiguity, right? Not all hypotheses are necessarily binary. So when they're not binary, you want to be relatively specific about what you consider the null or the opposite of the alternate or positive hypotheses. All right, so I'll answer these other questions later. Let's keep going. Okay, so we talked about section 3, experiments and data collection. So now we're still in section 3, right? So these are, this was the way to get that overview. All right, so to give you this high level overview of the execution, and an option was to use a table. But then for each one of those experiments, you want to explain is that maybe you were just not able to precisely measure the humidity or the temperature that your experiment was focused on evaluating, and you just want to describe that as a limitation, right? That so at this point, you're just basically describing the setup of your experiment. In the next part, you want to discuss how the data you collected is related to your hypothesis or hypotheses. You do not need to be exhaustive in this discussion, but it should be sufficient to understand why you executed the test, right? And these should be relatively self-evident from the nature of your test, right? Your hypothesis is about evaluating the effect of X on Y. So you collected data where X was varied and you observed Y. It's as simple as that. And we, you don't have to do this like necessarily as formally as this is concerned, but as this presents, but you should address it. You should explain why this data is relevant to the hypothesis is trying to explain or trying to address. And then if you can, please provide some examples of the collected data that you deem is representative and informative. We are not looking for you to dump all 100 spreadsheets or whatever you collected or whatnot. Your report should not be 1,000 pages of spreadsheets. But if you want to give an example of a spreadsheet, or if you want to give the summary of the data you collected as captured by a histogram or a PDF or a CDF, and if you want to annotate it, by saying like, this is where 90% of the data lives, or what have you, by all means do. This is just useful so people have an idea of what you actually did. And just to go back a little bit, when it comes to plan and execution and data relevance, you by all means use figures to explain this. You don't need to describe necessarily a physical setup in words. You can illustrate it, right, by just drawing a simple diagram, right? Where one block is Raspberry Pi A and another block is Raspberry Pi B, and you say that the distance between them is denoted by the variable d, and d is what you're varying. You can use diagrams by all means, right? However, whenever you use figures, be sure to follow the guidance on figures and tables discussed later in this document. And specifically, make sure you label your figures. Any figures that do not have axes labels, grid lines when appropriate, clear and legible font, colors that are not going to burn the retinas off out of my eyes. I don't want to see neon pink. Just think about if you had to stare at this, document, that you would be able to read it, right? And make sure you have figure captions and table captions. That's all addressed later, right? Can you clarify what we put in the first column of the table overview format? So this is just an example of how you might present this. And this experiment number is just I would refer to as a reference number. It is the way I'm going to refer to this experiment going forward. So this is experiment number 1. And if I did another experiment, there would be another row, and that would be experiment number 2. Alternatively, you could call it experiment name, and you could use a descriptive name. So instead of experiment number 1, it could be experiment name, and I could call this temperature experiments, or no obstruction experiment versus obstruction. And then second row could be obstruction experiment. All of that is just, it's a way for you to refer to it, right? Think of the first column as just the name of the experiment, or the way you're going to refer to these. So again, there's a question here about, doing multiple trials. You varied humidities. I'm going, and whether or not to consider these things as separate experiments. Again, this is a matter of organization. It is a matter of how you feel it is easiest to explain what you did, right? If you take the very granular route of explaining every single experiment individually, every single permutation of all the variables you explain, you may have 100 different experiments, and you're going to be, discussing every single one of those experiments is going to take time and effort and feel very repetitive, because you're changing, there's very small changes between one experiment and another. But, if you have 2 main things you're changing, right? Maybe you have you have one experiment where you're only changing one of those variables, and another experiment where you're changing another. And so you might have just 2 experiments, one where variable 1 is the thing that's changing, and another where variable 2 is the changing. And it's obviously you have now a bigger burden to explain each of those experiments, because there's more going on in a given experiment. But you're not explaining 100 different experiments. You're explaining 2, but with more detail. So unfortunately, I think we don't have clear guidance there, because it depends. It just depends on what you feel is easiest to explain. So I'm going to stop answering questions, because we're already at 4:45, and we still got the rest of this template to go through. And I just want to make sure we address all of it. Okay. So analysis. So for those I don't answer questions, please post them in Piazza, just so we don't lose track of them. I know we haven't necessarily answered some questions lately. It's been a very busy day for all of us. So the next section, analysis and algorithms. So in here, you want to present 2 main things. You want to describe what your analysis or algorithms consisted of. And so specifically with analysis, you want to describe the manner in which you distill the data you collected into logical and evidence-based conclusions, right? Because you're doing an analysis. So if you're going to make conclusion Y based on data X, you need to explain the arc or the connection between those 2 points, right? That if your conclusion is that obstruction X makes decreases RSSI values by a factor of Y, then you need to present the evidence, maybe referring to the examples you provided in the previous section about the data collections, about why this is true, basically that you observed it. So you need to explain and motivate why you are arriving at the conclusions you're going to be arriving at, which are what you're going to address in the next section. For descriptions of algorithms, you should include what the algorithm's goal was. And for a lot of the algorithms that are being considered, the goal is to maybe estimate distance based on RSSI, or to discriminate between within 2 meters and beyond 2 meters, or what have you. So that should be relatively concise. Describe the design of your algorithm. So pseudocode is very welcome here, or just reference, if you're doing some sort of machine learning algorithm, You can say, I'm doing a deep network with this many layers, with these sort of nodes, with this sort of activation functions, or you reference a paper. If you just took a sort of a canned algorithm off the shelf, you can reference that a paper, and any special implementation considerations. So, that why you chose to do it in a certain language, or you use other software. For example, somebody else's open source software, or use Keras, or use TensorFlow, or you used R or SciPy or whatever. Just so we're aware of anything specific to how you implemented what you evaluated. All right, so results and examples. So again, these are results and examples for your analysis and algorithms. So what your results should be are basically your conclusions. And I know it'll be somewhat duplicative with the next section, but this is where, after describing the analysis or the algorithms you're going to do, you're going to describe the outcome of executing that, right? Was it successful? Or what were the conclusions you came out of your analysis? Excuse me. Oh. Usually not this overwhelmed at this time of day, but what you should in this section, here's where you should either reference or provide or reprovide examples that support your results. And again, might feel very duplicative with the next section, but for those of you who are doing more algorithm-based work, your results may be showing the training and testing error convergence as you do multiple epochs of training, or showing an RC curve for a detector, or showing true positive and false positive rate, showing a detection matrix. If you're doing just analysis, you may have less to present here because you showed most of the examples previously, but you should refer to them, right? You can always refer to previously provided figures or tables or what have you. But you should be providing sort of the outcome of the analysis or algorithm design that you did earlier. Conclusions. All right. So this should be relatively straightforward. In a lot of ways, this should be sort of just putting together the scorecard for your hypotheses. So for each of your hypotheses that you enumerated, you want to evaluate them and address whether or not you found the hypothesis true, false, or indeterminate, right? Was it H0 versus H1? Or maybe you just couldn't come to a clear conclusion, right? The data didn't support going in either direction, which is a perfectly valid outcome. Just means the hypothesis either needs to be refined or more data needs to be collected, but it tells us, that where you think the work is at this moment. And give some indication about on what basis you made this assessment. Again, is likely to be duplicative with previous things you address in the previous section or sections prior to it, but you can always just refer to those sections. Just point to why you're ready to say this hypothesis was right, wrong, or none of the above. All right. On the back of every hypothesis, you want to present any specific and noteworthy conclusions you have on the basis of your evaluation, and these should be specific to the nature of your hypothesis or hypotheses. So we give one example. Here, your hypothesis may have been about the effect of obstructions on the use on RSSI, right? That your hypothesis was about phenomenology, about analysis, but a conclusion you've reached, right? Based on, and this seems to be a conclusion based on seeing that obstructions make it too difficult to get reliable RSSI values, that consequently they can't be used to detect proximity because they have too much variation, they're too unreliable. And you don't need to have an emphasis that's on any. If you don't feel like there are any noteworthy conclusions that aren't already captured by your hypotheses, then you don't need this section. All right, it's only if you feel like there's an additional or secondary or tertiary conclusion you can make based on the primary ones you presented earlier. And then the last section, lessons learned, is how you feel your hypothesis bubbles up to those higher level concerns or of that PACT or PIPACT or Bluetooth-based contact tracing are pursuing, right? So here's where you can feel like this is the bottom line for the practical goal of Bluetooth-based contact tracing, right? That if nothing else, this is what people should take away from your work that they should remember, right? That it may be a cautionary tale, it may be a sort of a supportive tale, saying, cautionary being like, whoa, hold on, Bluetooth may not be the best way of going about this, and the opposite may be in support, saying like, oh, we can definitely do this, right? That Bluetooth-based contact tracing has a lot of promise, and that machine learning algorithms have a lot of promise in this application. So bubble it up to the higher level thing. Give people that indication of how this impacts the bigger picture. So then the last section that is more sort of just writing is next steps. So you want to present the next steps you would take given more time and resources. So emphasis on more time and resources. So these tasks can be things you would do to reinforce, refine, and reevaluate your hypotheses and conclusions. So, if your hypothesis, if you came to a positive conclusion about your hypothesis, maybe the next step would be practical implementation of your hypothesis. So how would you take this particular aspect into the real world? And so we give you an example here where, maybe your hypothesis was measuring some environmental characteristic, and now the next step is, and you showed that that environmental characteristic improves the efficacy of detectors tenfold. And so, we should pursue this. But now the next step is, how do we get such a sensor onto smartphones, right? Because the smartphones don't usually have that sensor. So that is the next step. Or maybe your hypothesis was completely proven wrong. And so now the next step is to go and evaluate, what it would take to make it right, or maybe narrow down the scope, right? But if you don't have any obvious next steps, then that's fine, right? We want to hear your thoughts on where you think, what's the next step for this work, all right? Because at the end of the day, it's not likely that any of you have wrapped a nice, neat ribbon on everything you've done. There are things, if you had more time and more resources, you could and would address. So we want to hear about those things. The last section is just references. This is where you're going to insert full references. So make sure, use whatever citation style you prefer, but use it consistently. Be sure to use the appropriate template style. If you're using this template, this Microsoft Word template, you want to use the references style to insert the references, because they automatically make these as cross-references, so that when you refer to them throughout the document, you can use the cross-reference function. Just make sure you use that. And if you're using this template in Microsoft Word, try to use a cross-references option so that citations are automatically updated. All right, so that they automatically reorder themselves and create these in document links. Okay, so there was one question up here I do want to answer. because it has to do with some guidance that was asked about. So one question was, on the template it says use either SI or C. Oh, apologies for this. I copy and lifted this from the IEEE template. Please use whatever units you deem fit, but be consistent. So for whatever length unit you choose to use, inches, feet, or feet, yards versus, centimeters, meters, whatever, just continue to use the same length unit, same time unit, same, whatever unit. Just be consistent. You don't need to use the SI scale. So apologies for that. Ignore that guidance in the template. All right. So I'll answer one more question. Okay. So one small correction. We're going to be using Dropbox instead of Google Drive. It'll be relatively transparent to everybody, or maybe. We'll figure this out. Sorry. I know that's a little amateur of us not to have this settled, but it's a relatively easy thing to set up. We'll get you clarification shortly. So I'll answer these last two questions, and then the rest we'll have to answer in Piazza. And for the person who was not able to collect any data, I apologize. I've seen your question. I will get to you. I'll try to get to you today if I can find some time. Do we put code we got from outside in this references section? Yes. Please cite outside code. You don't need to cite the PyPack reference code. Don't worry about it. Whether or not it's referenced or not is fine. But any other outside code you got, please do. Whether or not you cite it in your document itself, we would like to see that citation so we know that was used. Can we use our code to explain what we were trying to do? I apologize that my coding skills aren't that good. I guess it depends on what you mean, what you're trying to do. If you intend to use code or pseudocode to explain higher level design goals, I would shy away from that. If you are using them to explain implementation, basically the way you translate goal design into implementation, then you can use code to do that. But I don't think code is a great way to describe your design of an algorithm to say, the input is RSSI values, 10 RSSI values taken over the interval of this much time, input into a trained machine learning algorithm, and then that output is thresholded by something. That you may lose some of that nuances in the code, particularly when you might be citing other things, right? When you may be citing a source for the machine learning algorithm, or citing how you came to the threshold. So I would caution against using code to describe design, but you can definitely use code to illustrate implementation. Okay, last question. Should full source code be included in an appendix, or is a link to the GitHub repo preferred? Link to the GitHub repo is preferred. So the rest of these questions, last thing I'll answer. So these are due on the 26th, all right? On July 26th, 1 week from yesterday. So you'll be required to submit your report, your data, and any code you've written to the link we provide, to the Dropbox or the Google Drive by midnight Pacific Standard Time. So that gives folks on the East Coast a little bit more time, but let's go midnight Pacific Standard Time on the 26th. So with that, I'm going to say this discussion is done for today. We'll update the daylight time. Yes, right. I will, yeah, I should have cited that as UTC, but my brain is not working properly at the moment. So we're going to say 4 UTC, plus 4 UTC on the technically on the 27th, which would be technically midnight East, or 7 UTC. Can't get it right on the 27th. Okay, so with that, we're going to call the discussion closed today. All right, so we'll try to get the rest of these questions on Piazza, but I hope, I'm confident y'all are going to submit something that's going to pass muster. Do your best. It is a good faith effort. Nothing else. Learn from this, please. If you've never written a technical paper before, this should be an interesting exercise for you, because trust me, if you want to continue to be on this engineering and science path, these are going to be in your future. So with that, I hope everyone has a good week and best of luck. Thank you.